Hey, and welcome back to the Morality Series. This is part 3, where I tackle something called the Nazi Challenge. Often in my amateur apologetics on YouTube, I have the atheist skeptic approaching me with what they would call a moral dilemma. There are several other scenarios they use. For instance, 4 people are on a life raft lost at sea. There's only enough provisions to support 3 persons. You can either try to survive on those provisions and possibly all die, or you can throw one person overboard and know that at least 3 people will survive. In this particular challenge, the scenario sets you up to either have to lie in order to protect some innocent lives, or you have to tell the truth and basically fail to preserve life. The idea is that you are harboring Jews in your home somewhere, and the Nazi regime knocks on your door and demands to know whether you're hiding these Jews or not. Before I get into my official answer on why this does not prove in any way, shape, or form that morality is relative, I would like you to watch yet another clip from Dr. Frank Turek.
Question: why are you in a dilemma with this scenario? You're in a dilemma because there is a moral law. In fact, there would be no dilemma if life wasn't so supremely valuable, right? If life wasn't valuable, you'd say, who cares? Throw everybody off. It doesn't matter. But you don't say that. Why? Because you realize that there is an absolute moral right to life. There would be no moral dilemmas unless there was an absolute moral law. The very fact that you're in a dilemma is because you recognize that absolute moral law. And in this fallen world where we have bad things happen, sometimes absolutes are going to conflict. That doesn't mean there's not a right answer. It means that sometimes you might not know what that answer is. But it doesn't prove that morality is not absolute. It is absolute. How about when the Nazi comes to your door? Right? What do you do then? Hast du Juden hier? You've got Jews upstairs in your attic. Schnell, schnell, kommen Sie hier. Hast du Juden hier? What are you going to do? You do. They're in there. Don't lie. Tell the truth to a murderer? What are you going to do? I know what I do. Lie. Why? Because when absolutes conflict, and Christians can disagree on this, but I'm just giving you my view. When absolutes conflict, the greater obligation takes precedence over the lesser obligation. You have a greater obligation to protect life than to tell the truth to a murderer. Now, some theologians like Augustine didn't agree with this, but I think, and this is called graded absolutism for those of you who are taking notes, that there's a hierarchy, and the hierarchy exempts you from the lower obligation. You can think of a hierarchy like this. We have the greatest obligation to God, the next obligation to people, and the final obligation to things.
Now, as you can see here, Frank believes in graded absolutes. He admits in his video that he would lie because there's a greater good and a higher moral law. Now, my answer is going to be different from his on the Nazi challenge, but overall I agree with him, and I believe to some degree the graded absolutes are demonstrated in several places in Scripture. I'm just going to highlight a few from the New Testament. Starting off in Mark 3, moral dilemmas and traps of this sort were presented to Jesus all the time. He was constantly being scrutinized by the Pharisees, and they were hoping to trap him in some sort of dilemma where he was going to be forced to disobey one law for another, and oftentimes that was with the Sabbath. In Mark 3, it reads, "Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him very closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill?' But they remained silent." Another instance of Jesus healing on the Sabbath is contained in Luke 13:10 and various other places. But in Matthew 12, we have another type of scenario with the Sabbath being in question, but this time it has nothing to do with healing. It has to do with eating. At that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to them, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." I suppose they thought it was a lot of effort and therefore work to pluck a piece of grain. I don't think it was actually the eating part. I think they felt like that they were harvesting crops on the Sabbath. So, as soon as they saw that, they went to Jesus and said, "Look, your disciples are doing wrong." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath and yet are innocent? I tell you that something greater than the temple is here," speaking of himself. If you had known what these words mean, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice," you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Interestingly, in this very short passage in Matthew, not only does Jesus say that his disciples are justified to eat these grains because they are appealing to a higher code of morality, he gives two other examples of how this was done in the Old Testament. So in this one verse, we technically have three different examples of how God has a graded moral law. Now, that's no different than our court systems. So this should make a lot of sense to the average person. We all agree that murder is worse than perjury. But here's how I would answer. If the door was knocked upon and I answered the door, I would basically kind of do what Jesus did. He always turned the tables on his accusers and started questioning them. So basically I might say something like, "How dare you accuse me of such things? Why don't you spend your time trying to find the actual enemies of the state instead of bothering patriots like myself? I'm insulted beyond belief, and I suggest you move along before I have a nice chat with your commanding officer."